Welcome to the latest episode of the Federal's Worldly Wise, a weekly video program that attempts to separate the meat from the bone of trending global events. United States President Donald Trump's back-to-back meetings with Vladimir Putin in Alaska and Volodymyr Zelensky in Washington have raised hopes of a breakthrough in the Russia-Ukraine war. Yet, with territorial disputes unresolved and NATO tensions simmering, the question remains deal or no deal. For Donald Trump, this is a high stakes gamble. He cannot be seen to lose, yet the way forward seems daunting. To decode this diplomatic challenge, I have with me the Federal's consulting editor K.S. Dakshina Murthy, who closely follows international issues. Thank you for joining me. So, before we get into the status of the war and the situation as it exists, let's talk about Trump. Sir, how important is it for the US president to see the war end?
If there is one thing that President Donald Trump has put all his stakes on, his reputation on, it is this particular war, the Ukraine-Russia war. Even during the campaign, this was a very important issue. And in fact, there are a lot of people in the US who were asking questions, why the US are spending so much of money on this war and what is the need to get into this. So Trump addressed this, and this was a major issue. And in fact, one of the reasons why Joe Biden, his predecessor, found it difficult to answer these questions, and eventually you had Kamala Harris losing the election. So for Trump, it's a large part of this, resolution. His reputation depends on this resolution. In fact, if you recollect, he even said he's going to resolve this in one day after he took over. But of course, that probably was a hyperbole. But what he really meant was that he meant his intentions were absolutely clear, and he is going to do it. And we have seen over the last, I would say, close to 8 months now. Jan 20th was the day when he took over. And over the last 8 months, if you see, he's really pushed on this. And in fact, to the point where he even called Zelensky to the White House, and then the exchange that happened. He humiliated him in front of the world's media, and trying to arm twisting him into agreeing with Putin. But what we see here is also his kind of a tilt towards Russia and Putin, and he has said in as many words that Russia has prevailed in this war, which means Russia has the upper hand. And he has indicated in many different ways that there needs to be some kind of a sacrifice that would have to be done, and he's not afraid of being seen as partisan. In fact, because to get a very even-handed resolution is very difficult. So, and for Trump himself, he has always been quoted as saying that he's very close to Putin. We saw that in the recent meeting, that in the recent summit, that they had their body language was very friendly. There was no friction. At least it was not apparent. And then you also had this kind of a conducive atmosphere that was there. So what has happened is that it has pushed this whole peace process forward. But the fact is that for Trump, he needs to see it over the line. Otherwise, it's going to be really a loss of face for him. And overall, what it also shows is that his attempt is going to show whether America still remains that big superpower that we all know, that the reputation that the US has. Whether it's actually going to walk the talk, whether the US is able to push, and Trump personally is able to push this whole peace process forward, and end up in peace. So for Trump, it's not only a huge stakes personally; it's also it's an indicator where the US stands vis-a-vis the rest of the world as far as its superpower status goes.
So, President Trump hosted Vladimir Putin in Alaska, but the talks ended without a ceasefire declaration. Even though, as you said, their gestures seemed friendly toward each other. So, do you see this as genuine progress toward ending the war, or just a diplomatic optics with no real outcome?
Well, that is the most important question because Europe particularly wanted a ceasefire to be had, to be, first the ceasefire and then the talks to proceed. But it hasn't worked out that way. And Putin, in fact, did not agree to it. Looks like he did not agree because even as the talks were going, attacks were continuing in Ukraine. So the war really hasn't ended. It may have gone a little low key, but it hasn't stopped. So, but then this is more a question of technicality because eventually, when there is a trilateral or even a bilateral between Putin and Zelensky. So when all these things happen, the war will naturally come to an end. It has to come to an end, obviously. So the ceasefire is not such a big deal. Though, if the ceasefire had been declared, it would have given a more positive feel to the whole talks. Now it is still up in the air because anything can happen, and we know that Trump is unpredictable, but Putin is equally unpredictable. So he can be very friendly at the same time. He can be extremely firm, and if his conditions are not met, it may still not go through.
When Zelensky met Trump, it was reported that he wanted Russian occupied territories to be returned to Ukraine, like Crimea or Donbas. So, is it realistic to expect Russia to return the land it has occupied, and will this affect the eventual outcome of the talks?
Again, this is an important sticking point, and so far, there has been no indication from Russia and Putin that they are going to give up on the territories they have already occupied, which means it's not only Donbas, it's the entire swathe of territory from the north to south to the east of Ukraine bordering Russia. So it apparently, it comes to about 20% of Ukraine's total territory. So it's a big swathe of land. And as far as Putin is concerned, this land, he says is very crucial for Russia because this will be the buffer zone. This will be the buffer zone for any future kind of a intimidation or belligerence that the West shows towards Russia. So he's touting it as a buffer zone, but at the same time, Zelensky cannot agree to this because if Zelensky agrees to this, there is going to be revolt within Ukraine. Because after all, at the end of the day, when the war is done and it's when the and peace returns, people are going to make an assessment of who won what and who lost what, and then Ukrainians, it will be very difficult for Zelensky to explain to his people why he cannot get back the territory which they lost during the war. For instance, if you take Crimea was occupied in 2014, earlier, much before this, and it has remained with Russia. There were sanctions against Russia. In fact, it was Crimea, the occupation of Crimea, that in some ways increased the hostility and tensions between Russia and Ukraine. And in some ways, it also isolated Russia, and sanctions were imposed on Russia. But nothing deterred Russia, and they continued to hold on to Crimea. So, if you see that also as another indicator, there is, just no, it doesn't look, at least at the moment, that there is any chance of Russia returning that land. And what kind of a leverage does Trump have over Putin for him to make Putin change his mind? There has to be a give and take. So, what is Trump going to offer Putin in return for the land that has been occupied by Russia? Back to give it back to Ukraine. I don't know what kind of a and then, if you also have seen the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he has also said that it's not going to be a very easy resolution. There is going to be sacrifices need to be made. Though he has not said who is to make the sacrifices, but sacrifices need to be made, and it is going to be a tough call as far as the final resolution is concerned. So These are some sticking points which I doubt whether they can get fully reverted back to the pre-Ukraine-Russia war.
So, European leaders have insisted that no deal should proceed without Ukraine's full participation. So, does Trump's approach risk creating a rift with Europe and weakening the broader Western stance against Russia?
Okay, there are two things in this. One is Zelensky's participation directly in talks with Putin and with Trump. Secondly, where does Europe stand in this whole thing? Now we have seen that Trump has in the past, in the recent past, completely ignored Europe and what Europe feels or says. Except more recently, when he has seemed to be a little more affable with Europe, and also you have the main NATO countries joining Putin and Zelensky recently, just the other day for kind of a larger kind of a discussion by with each other. So what this shows is that Trump has softened his kind of a harsh approach towards Europe. At the same time, Trump has never said that Zelensky should be kept out of the talks. So Zelensky will be very much part of these discussions. He has to be. In fact, Zelensky and Putin, there are all indications that they may even meet with each other independently, and then which means there would be a bilateral, and then there would be a trilateral in which Trump will join the three of them, and then probably Europe will join later. But in this whole thing, as far as Trump is concerned, Europe is dispensable. But he has not said the same as far as Zelensky is concerned. Zelensky is very much part of the peace process.
Putin has once again pushed for halting NATO's expansion into Ukraine as a condition for the very peace that we are just talking about. So, how much weight does this demand actually still carry? And is the US actually, signaling any room to compromise on this regard?
See, this was at the core of the fighting between Russia and Ukraine. If you recollect, Joe Biden, the previous US administration of Joe Biden, insisted that nobody could stop Ukraine from joining NATO. And the Western and the NATO's, Western allies, that is in Europe, insisted that again, Ukraine would be a member of NATO. So then you had Trump, then you had Putin. Sorry, then you had Putin warning both Biden and the European nations not to, provoke him, and said that this is a question of security of Russia, and that's how the whole rhetoric started. It slowly turned into a very serious issue, and eventually, unexpectedly, Putin invaded Ukraine. So this is the sequence of events that happened on Feb 24, 2022. So you had Putin invading Ukraine all of a sudden without any warning, with no, which nobody expected. Though some feared this, but nobody really expected this to happen. So Ukraine joining NATO is at the heart of this. And Trump, in the after in the many statements that he has made after his meeting with Putin, has clearly said that that is out of the question. Ukraine will not be part of NATO. Ukraine is not, cannot be a NATO member. So to that extent, Putin's first core demand has been fulfilled. In fact, I would even say that because Trump has been categorical in saying that Ukraine will not be part of NATO, that Putin has in fact agreed for further conversations and discussions, and the peace process has gone forward. This is in fact at the heart of it, that Trump has actually agreed with Putin that Ukraine will not be part of NATO. I think that is, settled now. I don't think that's going to change.
Thank you for your input, sir.
Yeah, thank you.